World's African Liberty Academy. We had 63 young people, very impressive young people from Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, and Tanzania, and professors going through market economy, principles of property rights, rule of law, very sophisticated, high-level stuff, and it was wonderful to be with them. And then I was just with colleagues in Namibia. Also, I'm happy to say the Free Market Foundation has a new, younger sister in Kenya. They just opened the Eastern Africa Policy Center, which is going to be providing policy information for the whole Eastern Africa region. So I'm really happy about that. A group of young business people who have made the decision. They had promising careers in business. They said, we're going to also devote our effort to promoting good economic policies, free market policies in our country. So what I want to talk about is economic freedom. And just a little bit of a discussion. I was in Namibia and recently and had a discussion, and the first question was, before we can have a conversation, what are we talking about? Because there's so much buzzing around the table. And let's just look at free market capitalism and some of the prominent definitions. Joseph Schumpeter, a very important figure. The subspecies of the system is characterized by private property, which tells us private property is necessary but not sufficient for having economic freedom. Carrying out new combinations of factors of production. There's an emphasis on innovation and involving the creation of credit. Joyce Appleby, very interesting historian at UCLA, in her book, The Relentless Revolution, private individuals take initiatives with their own capital, producing things that they can sell on the market. And Deirdre McCloskey, author of a really fabulous new book, Bourgeois Dignity. She's a very high-level economic historian and scholar. Private property and free labor without central planning, regulated by the rule of law and ethical consensus. And she summed it up, the age of innovation. I'll talk about why that is such an important element. So we think of capitalism, if you will, as an economic system. That's second nature to us. But fundamentally, deeper than that, it is a legal system. It's a system of law. This is something we now appreciate much more because of the experience of the Soviet Union. I remember Milton Friedman, when I was in the Soviet Union, he made an address to our first free market conference, if you will, run by the Cato Institute in 1990. And he said something that he later explained why he was in error. He said there are three things you must do: privatize, privatize, and privatize. Later, some years later, he said, you know, I did not understand the depth of the problem. Privatize into what? There was no legal system. No property law, no independent courts, no contract law. There was essentially no law. Law is the most important ingredient in an economic system. Much more significant for wealth than oil or diamonds or gold. Those pale into insignificance compared to the law, which is why Hong Kong and the Netherlands are two of the richest countries in the world, and there's nothing there. Hong Kong is a big rock covered with Chinese people, and the Netherlands is below sea level. They have to make the earth. But what they do have is good law. But then it's also one more element that scares many people. It's this cultural and social system of relentless innovation. A system in which well-defined, legally secure rights, including, and this is quite significant, of course, in Southern African context, careers open to talent. No one is forbidden by any law to offer their services to other willing customers. And innovation that is decentralized, happening all around us. There's no Ministry of Innovation. If you imagine that, it's a scary thought. In fact, there's a book by Ayn Rand, pictures outside, in which he discusses a future where there's essentially a Ministry of Innovation, and it doesn't turn out well. I don't want to ruin the book for you, but civilization collapses as a consequence. The innovation in the market goes through trial and error. It's happening all around us. Apple Computer was founded in a garage, not in a giant bank. Many of these institutions start tiny. They're all around us. Most of them will fail. They're not, in fact, good ideas. How do we know the good ones? We have profit and loss in the market economy. That's the key. Profit tells you you're adding value, and loss tells you you've destroyed value. You're subtracting value from the world. So it's a very powerful signal. And one of the key distinctions, and I find when people complain about what they call free market capitalism, it always comes down, what they're really complaining about is cronyism. What we could call crony capitalism, if you will. Nominally private ownership. These are not state socialist institutions. They're in the hands of private persons, but they are the friends of the prime minister or the president or the king. They are the people who have access to power, and the rules are bent for them. Other people are forbidden to enter various professions, and so on. So the alternative to free market is really no longer socialism. Let's be very open about that. That's dead. It's over. The real alternative today is cronyism. And cronyism is alive and well all around the world. No country is immune to it, but some countries have the disease worse than others. You can do better. It comes from the Greek chronios, long-term, and it refers to old buddies, long-term friends of people in power are their cronies. And if you support those politicians, the ones who get into power, they'll bend the rules for you. They'll exclude other people from the market so they cannot compete with you. You'll get the monopolies and so on. Cronyism is a feature of interventionism and of having a set of legal rules that discriminate among citizens. Some get special privileges, the others are excluded from the market and forbidden from competing or offering their services. Now, some people are shocked that I argue that there's a moral foundation to free market capitalism. It's not just about economic efficiency. That's not the whole game. It's what most economists talk about, understandably. But we can also talk about free markets with the language of poetry and psychology and so on, and also morality. And there's a very fundamental point that every human being matters. No one matters more than another in the law. Every person should have equal standing. And that means respect for property. And here, the English word property has shrunk in significance from its earlier meaning. Today, in English, we would say, this is my property. But someone of the time of Adam Smith would not have said that. They would have said, I have a property in this thing. It's a very different meaning. This would be called my estate. But instead, I have a property in my person, in my freedom, and then in my estate, my stuff. But English has shrunk down. So property now only refers to things. But the original meaning comes from what is proper to you, proper. And my freedom and my life are proper to me. They are as much my property, indeed more so. They're foundational than my stuff, my estate. But if we want to talk now about economic exchange, your estate needs to be characterized by the 3 Ds. These are absolutely fundamental for experiencing economic freedom. Property and estate should be definable. This is one thing you find in poor countries all over the world, failure of the legal system to define property. And people are in conflict constantly over water, over land, over other scarce resources. So the legal system has to make it clear what's yours and what's mine. This was a topic I was really interested. I met a number of Herero farmers in Namibia, and they sat down, and it was like talking to Ronald Coase, Armin Elchian, and Harold Demsetz, the great property rights economists. They explained the disaster that they face of having communal land. You cannot exclude someone from adding more cows to it. The consequence is overgrazing and destruction of this valuable resource. So it should be definable, it should be defendable. My property claim is something that I should be able to defend against others who infringe on it. This is the second area where we have systematic state failure in much of the world. States don't defend property claims, or the courts of law are cumbersome and corrupt, or the state itself is the biggest predator. Those with power see what they like and confiscate it from others. The third one, divestible. Easy to remember, 3 Ds. For a lot of people, divestible is an almost foreign word. It means transferable, but we couldn't use transferable because then you'd have DDT, which, as you know, is illegal and banned by the World Health Organization. So we had to have DDD. It should be transferable at relatively low cost. And this is a matter of the efficiency of the legal system is absolutely important for the efficiency of the economic system. In many places in the world, transferring property, selling a house or something like that, is an immensely complicated and difficult procedure because it's covered over with legal privileges, difficulties, encumbrances, and so on. So a very simple example, take Canada or United States and Guatemala, a country I frequently visit. I learned something. In Guatemala, to have a will, a last will and testament, requires a lawyer, has to draw it up. And they put more ribbons and stamps on it than a Habsburg treaty. It's a very elaborate, big document. That costs a lot of money. It could cost as much as $150 in legal fees. But if my estate is only $1,000, I'm a poor farmer someplace, 15% just to draw up a will. The consequence is poor people don't have wills, and their heirs squabble and fight over the resources. In the United States or Canada, if I want to make a will, I get a will form from the stationery shop for 50 cents. I fill it out, it says blank places. I get 3 random people to witness that I signed it. It's a legally valid will. It costs about half $1. Or I can go to willmaker.com, costs $17.95, and do it online. It's easy. And that's a perfectly legitimate and valid will. That's one of the differences between Guatemala, high cost, inefficient legal system, relative to Canada. Low cost, much more efficient legal system. And then the corollaries, equality before the law, the presumption of liberty, which is an absolute key. There may be reasons to restrict our right to restrict our freedom to contract or exchange if it's harmful to someone else. But you shouldn't have to justify every act in advance. In some countries, in order to form an association, you must go get permission from the Ministry of Denying Permissions to people. And this takes forever. It's horrible experience. Months and months and months, and bribes and so on. The presumption should be, if you want to form a chess club, you just form a chess club. You don't have to ask the permission of the chess ministry. And similarly in economic exchange, the burden of proof is on those who would restrict your freedom, for which there may be good reasons, not on you to justify it. And then this rich phrase, the rule of law, which is difficult to translate in some other languages, but the fundamental principle that everyone can grasp is when 2 people go to a court of law with a dispute, the judge asks 2 questions. What is the law and what are the facts? And the religion, language, political party membership, family relations, and so on of the parties are irrelevant and do not enter into the discussion. That's very important and, in fact, very difficult to achieve. Most countries get what they call telephone justice. The Ministry of Justice telephones the judge and explains what the verdict will be. And so rule of law is hard to achieve. It means banning communication between the minister and the judge, as an example. Now, I want to point out one issue that's quite significant, particularly I saw it in Namibia, and that's the tragedy of the commons. If you go to the Philippines, people fish with dynamite. I've seen this happen. It's easy. You toss dynamite into the water, the fish are stunned, you catch them. Or they use bleach, which asphyxiates the fish, and you can catch them. But it kills the coral reef, which is a living organism, and when it dies, it can't sustain any more fish. It becomes an underwater desert. When they ask the fishermen, why do you do that? This is the answer they all give. If I don't catch the fish, someone else will catch the fish. There won't be any fish for me. They won't restrain their behavior just because I restrained mine. So you end up with this problem of overfishing. This is actually quite serious global environmental problem, is overfishing because of lack of property rights. In contrast, Canada and offshore areas, parts of the United States, New Zealand and Iceland have established tradable property rights and effectively dealt with this problem. It helps us to conserve resources and to generate the capital value of assets. The capital value of an asset is equal to the sum of all the rents it will generate into the future, discounted by the rate of interest. And that's only possible if you can exclude people from capturing those rents with a property right. You get a property right, you can generate a capital value, and that's a signal to the owner, maximize the capital value, is the same as maximizing the sum of all the benefits that it will generate. Well, they have this problem in Namibia that I went out and talked to quite a few farmers. People can add more cattle to the communal lands. They're over-consuming the grass, and the consequence is a catastrophe. And several farmers said, we know thousands of cattle are going to die in the next 3 months. This is the die-off period. And they're being killed off by bad land management. We want private property rights. That will allow us to maximize the capital value. And what was particularly interesting, was what are we going to do here now? So back, okay. The fact that this was explained to me as a matter that I needed to understand by people who did not speak Afrikaans or English or Portuguese. They were speaking in their own language and trying to explain to the ignorant foreigner the economics of property rights. I was really struck by how well they understood that. But there's more to it than just property rights that are well-defined, legally secure, and transferable. There's a cultural dimension as well. Entrepreneurship, innovation, service, adding value, and respect for the law. The business people, entrepreneurs, understand their legal restraints and often internalize things one doesn't do because they're dishonest and wrong. And focusing on the adding of value, let's see if I can make this work. Now, just a few quick words, and I want to talk about some data and look at measurable economic freedom. The English language has been poisoned, in a way, with anti-market thoughts brought in linguistic competition. These are the phrases that come to my mind quickly. Dog-eat-dog competition and cutthroat competition. Fair, honorable, just competition. They don't trip off the tongue. These are images of extreme violence. Just imagine a German Shepherd eating a poodle. It's a very repulsive thought. Or cutthroat. Cut the throat of a person and murder them. These are images of violence. But in the market, firms compete in order to cooperate. The point of the competition is a cooperative interaction with other people. Two firms, whether it's two car producers or two clothing manufacturers, are competing with each other to get my business, or my custom, as the English say. It is fundamentally a cooperative system. Exchange, selfish and greedy. Everyone wants what's good for himself. But in fact, it's mutually beneficial. No one exchanges voluntarily to harm himself or herself. I learned this again in Guatemala. Sometimes you learn this in an economics class, but then you really see it in practice. I was in a Guatemalan market with a friend of mine, Estuardo Zapeta, who's a Mayan anthropologist. He speaks the Mayan languages. And we went up to the Mayan highlands, and one of the things we did was went to the market, bought some wonderful things, and I stopped and I turned to Estuardo. I said, I feel bad now. I said, why? I said, I've been haggling with this merchant and I realized I was bargaining over less than $1. And that just seems so wrong to me. To me, it's not much. To him, it's a lot of money. It's going to be half of his profit for the day might be that $1. And Estuardo said, Tom, sit down. I said, okay, why? He said, put his hand, he said, you have caught a virus. You have the socialist virus. You think we indigenous people are stupid, and we sell things to white people at a loss. He said, let me explain something. We don't do that. If an indigenous merchant says yes, he made a profit. And judging by your bargaining skills, a rather handsome one at that. He said, he added though, he said, if you really want to ruin an indigenous merchant's day and make him miserable all day long, here's what you do. You say, how much is this? And he says, that's 500 quetzales. Say, okay, and give him the 500 quetzales. For the rest of the day, he's going to be saying, I could have charged that moron 1,000. He'll be so angry for the rest of the day. Trade that is voluntary is mutually beneficial. And finally, profit. These are the phrases that typically come to obscene profit, windfall profit. But a profit is a measure of value added. That's the key. If you have an honest profit, not cronyism, not corruption, not stealing, but through production and exchange, you added value to the world. At least the amount of your profit, in fact, a lot more. Because the consumer, the purchaser, profited as well. Entrepreneurship has a long history, and let me just go through 3 elements of entrepreneurship. Risk, arbitrage, and innovation. Absolutely significant. Richard Cantillon, one of the first writers on entrepreneurship, an Irish banker who wrote in French, he talked about paying a fixed price for their purchase to resell at an uncertain price. Very interesting. The entrepreneur is the bearer of risk, which is a very important role in a market economy for people to specialize in risk. But there's another element as well. Israel Kirzner is focused on alertness to unperceived opportunities in the form of arbitrage. Apples are selling at this price here and this price here, and you notice the differential. That's profit opportunity. And what happens? You bid up the price here and sell them here, and you can arbitrage out those inequalities, if you will. That's the entrepreneur does that, not the Ministry of Arbitrage. And further, even deeper, unperceived opportunities for new ways to do things that no one else had thought of. We were talking, coming to the airport, I had these wonderful luggage with the 4 little wheelie wheels you could move around. I'm old enough to remember there were no wheels on my luggage when I was a boy. You had to lug them, which is how it got the name. It seems so obvious to put wheels on luggage, and yet it seems to have taken hundreds of years for this to occur to anyone. But somebody did. And then 4 wheels, so you could move it and twirl it around and have airport ballet and so on. It seems obvious now, but it wasn't for a long time. Somebody thought of that. Henry Ford is reputed to have said, it may be apocryphal, but I see it quoted all the time, so I'm cautious. If I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. But he thought there was something else that hadn't occurred to them they might want, which was an affordable automobile that a working class person could afford. Now part of that, though, is something that people don't like. Schumpeter talked about creative destruction. A system of economic freedom involves destruction. That sounds very negative. But it has another element. It's creative destruction. So the example I like to give, especially to younger audiences like this one, is the typewriter. When I was a boy, I actively thought I might become a typewriter repairman, because it was a job. You had to wear a cool uniform, go to the office, you were respected. There were typewriter repair shops everywhere and typewriter factories. What happened to them? They're all gone. I haven't used a typewriter in years. The whole industry was destroyed. But it was destroyed by something a lot better. All the times I tried to watch movies on my typewriter, it never worked. I couldn't have calls with people in Japan on my typewriter. This is much better. So we destroyed industries and replaced them with something that added more value. A friend of mine's son recently came up to him. He was a little boy at the time. And he said, "Daddy, come look." He said, "What?" He said, "There's a computer but no screen." Of course, a typewriter. He didn't understand. And finally, when he showed him, he said, "Oh, you mean it prints in real time?" Which is an interesting take on typewriting. So Schumpeter focused, he said, usually when people criticize or talk about it, they visualize how capitalism administers existing structures. The relevant problem is how it creates and destroys them. The antitrust authorities in the United States are talking about how dangerous Facebook is. Right? Everyone's on Facebook now. Your cat is probably on Facebook when you're not watching. So it has to be broken up. So we'll have Chinbook and Apple will have iBook and so on. Right? We'll break it all up. But actually, much more important, the guys at Facebook are terrified of some teenagers in a garage someplace coming up with something better that will challenge them. They don't need to be addressed by antitrust. Let me skip over this a bit on property and talk a little bit about how the world has been changed when economic freedom began to grow in the world. In some parts of the world, faster than others. Angus Madison, the Danish statistician, compiled the data on per capita income for all the regions of the world from the year 1 until his death, about 2005. And it's quite striking. It's flat for a long time. Little bump in the high Middle Ages, Europe and the Southern Song Dynasty in China. It collapses in the general crisis of the 17th century. Let's think of the 30 Years' War in Europe. And then around 1800, sometime between 1800 and 1820, per capita income goes through the roof. And as you see, other parts of the world later, but all countries of the world, even the late starters, are so much wealthier than they were in the past. This is what Deirdre McCloskey calls the great fact. The question is, what caused that? She says, we now know the answer, and it is the emergence of free market institutions, the right to freedom of trade, and the dignity of being in business, and the respect that was accorded to it. Now, I was asked a couple of times, well, hasn't capitalism failed? Because right over here, there was a tiny 1.5% dip that then was recovered from. I said, well, that's one way to look at it. The dipping from here to here for several years and then recovering would constitute a failure. But let me imagine this was the path of your career. And you start in the labor market here at 20, and afterwards you're here, and then you have a little setback, your income drops by 1.5% and then recovers. Would I call your life a failure? Probably not. So even if you think that the general financial collapse was due to markets, which I do not, it'd be hard to call that a failure. Now let's turn to economic freedom. Our colleagues in Canada, the Fraser Institute, have a measurement. All the data, freetheworld.com, it's a publicly available database. Anyone can download the data, criticize it, run regressions, compare with other data sets. It's a completely transparent program. And they attempt to measure economic freedom and look at countries around the world. And the key measurable components, there are 5. Size of government, and the point being, the more the government is deciding on the allocation of resources, the less freedom the citizens are experiencing. The legal system and security of property rights, access to sound money, is it easy or difficult to trade across international borders, and regulatory burden. Is it easy or difficult? Is the regulatory system efficient or not? They compile a ranking of 152 countries around the world based on these components, so 42 subcomponents, and then they generate an overall index. Let's look at what they find, dividing countries into quartiles. So these different degrees of economic freedom. And they found some things that were quite striking. The first is that per capita income is rather robustly correlated with economic freedom. Now, it's possible correlation and causation are different. It could be wealthy countries say, hey, we're rich, maybe we should adopt economic freedom. But that doesn't happen. That's very easy to test for. Poor countries adopt economic freedom and become wealthy. We take the case of South Korea. The real takeoff point for South Korea is when they joined the GATT and opened themselves up to international trade. South Korea was a poor country devastated by war, lower per capita income than Ghana in 1960. Now it's a fabulously wealthy democratic country. Economic growth is robustly correlated. Now, here's one of the points where compound interest matters. This doesn't look like a big difference between the two, except when you add that difference over 15 or 20 years. And the difference between growing at 3.5% average and 1.5% average is huge. It's not a minor difference. to grow at different rates. We often hear it said, the rich grow richer and the poor grow poor. I just hear that all the time. And I do something rude when people say it. I say, really? May be true. How do you know? And they don't know. They just heard it. No one I've ever asked that question of has given me an answer. I say, it might be true, it might not be true. How do you know? And never have I heard an answer to the question. Well, they measured the income share of the poorest 10% and then plotted it against degree of economic freedom. And this was interesting. There's no correlation at all. It's about 2.5%. That was quite striking, and the surprise in the statistical analysis. But now here's the one that I think matters. It matters what your income is. Or, to put it in terms everyone can understand, if you're going to be in the lowest 10%, it's much better to be a poor person in an economically free country than in an economically unfree country. If I were to be poor, I'd rather be poor in Belgium than Burma or Switzerland compared to Swaziland. If you're poor in Switzerland, it means you don't have an iPad. Well, boo-hoo. That's sad. And you don't have a really cool mobile phone. But if we all understand, if you're poor in Benin Republic or Burma or Burkina Faso, you do not have clean water. You watch your children die before they reach the age of 4 or 5. You suffer terribly. You are probably illiterate and you expect your children to be illiterate. That's the difference in poverty in Switzerland and poverty in Burma. Life expectancy, also robustly correlated, and this is obviously a secondary feature of the higher incomes. People can afford better food, better medical care, and so on. It means they live longer. This one is very interesting and complicated. Economic freedom and political rights and civil liberties are strongly correlated together. Now, this is much more complex. It deserves a lot more study. We don't exactly understand the linkages between these. Which causes which. There are models in which some countries have had democratic freedom and adopted more economic freedom, or they've liberalized the economy and become more politically free. That's the South Korean model or the Indian model, to take an example. But we know that they're strongly, strongly correlated. The key element is that incentives and institutions matter. And we can test this around the planet. Incentives are what guide people in the choices they make. Institutions give form to the incentives. So an image I like to show to college students is, what is this? Unfortunately, I didn't trim this one, so I'll cover that up. We all know. That's a photograph taken at night from an exceptionally tall ladder of the Korean Peninsula. North Korea and South Korea. And it's an opportunity to test theories of economic development. We often hear people say, if you're behind, you can never catch up. Well, South Korea was once poorer than North Korea, which had much more industrial capacity at the end of the Korean War. And they were poor relative to the West. Not anymore. They caught up in one generation. Sometimes we hear it's culture. Some cultures just can't have economic growth. Catholics, or whatever theory of the month is being offered. Samuel Huntington or others. Muslims can't be economically productive, or Catholics can't, or whatever. Well, they had the same culture, same language, same people, same history. Some people say if you were colonized, you could never grow. They were colonized by the Empire of Japan, which was an exceptionally brutal colonial experience. They attempted to exterminate Korean culture, forbade the speaking of Korean language, and as we know, that what was done to Korean women by the Japanese soldiers, these so-called comfort women, who were sex slaves of the Imperial Army, hundreds of thousands of women systematically raped in rape camps. And yet, tremendous economic performance here and nothing here. I've been to North Korea. It is one of the saddest places in the world. It's difficult to describe. Well, the question is, what incentives do people have to create light? And markets and economic freedom creates incentives. Innovate to produce wealth. Let me conclude with some thoughts on different kinds of incentives and games. So game theory, I run into college students all the time. They all know about zero-sum games. It's a game or a strategic interaction which the sum of the benefits and costs equals zero. And people think these are omnipresent. So if I come up and someone were to grab my cane, take it from me, that person would have the cane and I would have a negative cane. Their gain was equal to my loss. In fact, those almost never happen. They're the rarest kind of interaction imaginable. Normally, when someone tries to take my cane, they're going to get a good thumping as a consequence with the cane. Most games of that sort are negative sum, in which the sum of the gains and losses is minus. So let's say someone robs me, stabs me, beats me, and clubs me. In my wallet, I have maybe about 40 euros. So they'd get my 40 euros. I suspect my hospital bills, pain and suffering, will be worth a lot more than that. Let's say 1,000 euros. So that's still good for them. They get the 40 euros. I suffer 1,000 euros. The sum total of it is minus 960 euros. They're all around us. Negative sum games are all around us, including, especially, in politics. But markets are about positive sum games, in which the sum of the benefits are positive. Because when two people exchange, they both expected to benefit. That's a positive sum game. It's in the nature of a voluntary exchange. So what we need is positive sum games. We need the institutions and the incentives that induce people to engage in positive sum behavior rather than predatory behavior, the negative sum game, or the elusive, almost non-existent zero-sum game, which is somewhat taken as paradigmatic of human interactions, but in fact almost never happen. Well, I could talk a bit more about cronyism, but I thought maybe it's a good time to have an open conversation and discussion and hear thoughts that people have in the context of South Africa, of the Economic Freedom Manifesto that was an interesting reading for me, and the future of this country.